So Lisa Boscov-Ellen is a translator, researcher, and writer based in New York. She studied Latin American and Latina studies at Vassar College and is an MA candidate in the Literary Translation Studies program at the University of Rochester. She's translated selections by Ana Maria Matute, Jorge Edwards, and Hebe Uhart for this anthology, 1,000 Forests in One Acorn, which was published by Open Letter. Chad Post is the publisher of Open Letter Books, where he also oversees the website 3%, which is home to the Best Translated Book Awards and the Reading the World Conversation series. He's also the author of the book, The 3% Problem, Rants and Responses on Publishing, Translation, and the Future of Reading. Yeah, they worked together on this incredible, monumental, and really sort of unusual anthology, and I wondered if you two could tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, I can start with that, because Lisa plays a part in it, but there's even a larger story to it. This anthology was published in Spain. Valerie Miles, who's a writer, researcher, editor of Granta in Spain, editor long time for Santillana, I believe, had put this book together as a way of getting all the great writers a lot of great writers that were working in Spanish from the 20th century primarily, or it has to be, that were living, that could choose the best thing they ever wrote. So they picked out like 15 pages that was literally the best thing they'd ever done, and then she interviewed them to get them to explain like who their influences were, what this piece, why they chose this particular piece, so on and so forth. And the book in Spanish is 800 pages long, and she came through her agent, Andrew Wiley, to us and said, we would like to do an English version of this. We have like the rights to everything. Would you like to do this project? And I was like, well, hell yeah, but like it's an 800-page book with 28 different authors in it and a million different moving parts, because some of these pieces had been published in English before, so we had to get the rights to the Carlos Fuentes excerpt of Terra Nostra that he used. A lot of them, or some of them, had not, so we had to find people who would be able to translate those and then weave everything together into one coherent, long book. So I worked with probably like 14 different people to put this thing together, be it like interns who were scanning and proofing the Terra Nostra, to Lisa and a few of the other translators. We had 4 different translators that were working on the pieces that had never appeared, and then Will Vanderheiden, who graduated at the same time, I was in the same class as Lisa, helped as kind of a overall in-between editor, where he was helping collate things and helping me put this all together. Because the promise at the press, we were 3 people, and Kaya Straumanis does most of the editing. I do most of the publicity and marketing and publishing stuff, and Nate does all the design. And when this came along, my promise was, I will do all of this book, so you guys don't have to do any part of it, because it's a huge, gargantuan project. So then Lisa ended up translating 3 of the pieces for this, and you can talk about your 3.
Yeah, it was actually multiple pieces. It was 3 authors. So Matute just had one excerpt from a huge 900-page fairy tale fantasy epic, essentially. And then Edwards, it was 2 excerpts. And there was another Edwards piece that had already been translated from Persona non grata. And then the Uhart was 2 short stories and 1 excerpt as well.
Right. And all these are very different. I'm going to add on something to before you ask your question. One of the things that was weird or tricky for me working on editing this, and I did a lot of it in a snowy day like this in Minnesota, where I was trapped while we were meeting with our consortium representatives, and it was blizzardy. So I sat in a cafe and read tons of these. But every single piece is vastly different, and it's supposed to be. These are supposed to be the voices and styles of this generation of authors, or multiple generations of authors that are working in Spanish. So each one of the translations, the challenge that I saw was trying to find and make sure that their style, their unique voice, why this is the best and why this was the thing that they would choose is coming through, and at the same time make sure that it's working in English. So the day that I worked on your piece, because I didn't do any of these necessarily in order, I also worked on one by Aurora Venturini that Steve Dolph translated, in which it's narrated by a character who is supposedly like slow. And one of the things about the speech patterns in there are very weird. There's there's very little punctuation. And I remember working explicitly with his on trying to remove as many commas as possible and make it as simplistic as possible to have that voice come through even stronger than it had. And then switching from that to Matute, which is crazy, and is like it's not a nymph that's under the water, whatever, the underwater, it's the nymph that's underwater that's talking and like controlling things, and they're putting spells on characters, and it's got all this like fantasy language, which had at times had the danger of going almost too overboard, to where it was almost too much like The Hobbit meets Game of Thrones told by a Spanish woman. So it sort of had to tone down things in there versus trying to emphasize it in these other pieces. So every one of these was a different set of challenges editorial-wise.
Yeah, absolutely. That piece in particular, that's interesting to hear that, because I had to really push to get the kind of fantasy voice. That was really the main challenge of that one for me. I had my Tolkien-loving little sister look over it and make sure. But yeah, I think that one was definitely probably the one that needed the most editing of the ones I did, I would say.
That's absolutely true.
And how did you end up translating those 3 authors? Was it just you drew lots and you were like, you get the fantasy Tolkien one?
Well, that's weird, because the Matute you wanted to do first.
The Matute is the one that I wanted to do, because it is interesting. That was the hardest for me, because I was very familiar with a lot of her other work, which is not in a fairy tale fantasy voice. So that was, I hadn't read any of that novel, so that was a real shock for me. And then I think Will did he mostly assigned the ones that hadn't been translated.
We sort of split them up based on like different people's interests, or what we thought they would be most like fitting for. Yeah, regional interest based on which country they were from, but also like the things I knew about you guys as to like what you would be most into.
Yeah, I think, well, I probably ended up with the other 2 authors because they're from the Southern Cone, and that's the Spanish that I know most well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how much of the book is new translations, and how much of it is?
If I remember correctly, 12 of the 28 authors the pieces that are in here had never been translated.
Okay.
There's one like the Jorge Edwards, there's like a piece that had been, but 2 of them had not. And there's a few other that fit in that category where they included like little snippets. And one of those might have appeared in a magazine a long time ago, but the other part had not. So it's not quite half and half. It's more like 35-40% is new. The rest was stuff that we were pulling. But all of the interviews are new. So like even though there's a Javier Marias piece in here, or a few of them, his interview, which is substantial, was the interview that he gave over like a series of weeks with Valerie, and all of that stuff is like had to be translated as well, and also like translated into their voices, because each one of them is fairly distinct. So Javier Marias' answers to his questions are very different than Aurora Venturini's. So even that part was complicated, of making sure that as an interview and that nonfiction type of editing, where the interview sounds like the person explaining this rather than being a fictional thing that you're tweaking.
Right. So this was a huge translation project, among other.
It took years. It took 2 years, I believe, to put this all together.
Yeah. And were you working mostly with students in the program, it sounds like? Or
no, Heather Cleary did a bunch of pieces too, and Steve Dolph did, who have both translated for us for different authors in the past, and I'd worked with as well. And then a lot of it was like these poor sucker interns that come up to Rochester who I'm like, hey guys, you can work with Open Letter. Here's your first job. Here's like a 400-page book that you can scan in page by page, do all the OCR stuff, and then proof it word by word and letter by letter. And if there's a mistake, I will tell you and make you feel bad. So you're welcome.
And now translate it from Spanish.
Yeah. Translate it from Spanish.
I can see why you don't like graduate from this program. You probably escape from this program.
But you should say that you changed your thesis because of this book.
I did, actually. Yeah, I had a whole other project, and I loved working on the Uhart so much.
Yeah.
It really, it was striking to me how much easier that came to me than some of the other work I'd done. It made a real impression on me, and I ended up totally switching my thesis topic and doing some short stories by her instead.
Okay. That's great. I wonder if you could talk more about that, because I loved all the pieces, but the Uharts were a real revelation for me. I thought, these are just so funny and so sharp, and I'd never heard of her. I'd never encountered her before.
Yeah, I think she's not as well known as she should be, perhaps as her male Argentine writer counterparts are. Yeah, I do think that. I agree. I think there's a real humor to her work. She has kind of an ironic, biting sense of humor. She has a real knack for kind of capturing a character just with one action or a line of dialogue. And she talked in the interview some about the orality of her work, and that was really a lot of my focus Her work really comes alive when it's read aloud, and I wanted to try to replicate that in English. And trying to capture the personalities of characters in just little snippets of dialogue, the way that she does so successfully, was definitely a real challenge as well. Yeah.
I'd pulled out, like, I went through our archives, and I thought that I might have all of our stuff that was from editing this, and I found it, and I could tell it was mine because it had coffee spilled everywhere, and it was like all crinkly and just destroyed. So I pulled out your ones, and the thing, looking at that, the thing that we mostly changed or edited, well, there's two things that are interesting. This archived version was one that I teach 2 classes at the university, and in the literary publishing class, they have to proof or edit a book, and so they edited part of this, and so I have some student, I forget who it was, their edits in like blue ink, and then mine in red pencil over top of that. So it's curious to see like that they did nothing. The person who, I hope that I don't think they'd be here. I don't think they'll ever see this. They were awesome. They were a great student. I don't remember who they were, but all this person wanted to do is add in paragraphs and change all the punctuation to quotation marks and things like that. Like that was the biggest obsession. This happens almost every single class I teach, that when they go to edit or proof things, their biggest concern is that paragraphs are too long and that the punctuation isn't the way that we do quotation marks in American writing. And I always have to try and break them as hard as I can. So I use like Arno Schmidt's book to like, I give them excerpts of that and I'm like, read this and now tell me about your punctuation issues. But going back to the Earhart thing, the only thing that's ever changed in here is trying to make it sound more rhythmic and more spoken and more colloquial in that sense. Like everything, your translations are very smooth. It's very much making sure that there's no moment as a reader where you hit that and say like, this clearly isn't right. Like something's not, this isn't how someone would say that.
Yeah, I think that she very effectively will kind of draw you in and then hit you with like one line that really stands out. And because of that, I think that is especially important with her work.
Yeah.
What did you change your thesis to be?
It's just a collection of short stories from Ufberg. I actually just picked from her collected stories.
Okay. I'm very excited about that because if you haven't read the anthology, you really should. There's a story in it about a woman who's looking at her plants, and it's just a couple of pages, and it starts from her just observing her sort of stoop garden or her window garden, and it spirals out, and within like 3 pages she's saying, I'm a witch, and this is why I'm a witch, and it has just this like beautiful, beautiful ending that somehow involves the Troy ounce, which nobody's ever heard of, and it travels so far in such a very short space.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Did you find it weird working on hers? There are 2 stories and then the one excerpt. Was that weird for you?
That
That
was definitely a challenge, and with some of the other pieces that were excerpts as well. I am a very thorough person. I kind of relish the research part of translation, and so not having the time to really read the whole piece. I like to read the whole thing. I like to read similar authors, any references they mention, and not being able to do that, especially with the excerpts, was definitely difficult. I felt like I was kind of guessing sometimes. Yeah.
I can see that especially with the Matute one.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so was Valerie Miles involved as well? Like, did she?
She wasn't. She's busy doing lots of other things that she works on. So she translated a handful of the pieces that are in here. Okay. I know that she did the Villamatas one, and I forget what the other one was. And then a couple of the interviews, because there were ones. What was weird, the Javier Marias one actually was done in English. And she had to translate it into Spanish. And then when this was coming out, she had to go back and find the English one, and they tweaked it somewhat based on what had happened with the Spanish version and since then. So it was like an extra strange layer. But she saw the whole book and like was kind of kept up to date as things went along. But I don't think she ever read it start to finish in the English version for this. But she was going through her sections and editing Valerie, who had edited the book, was a weird circular experience too, because she's a fantastic editor in her own right, who's worked with all these amazing authors. So having to like push her in some ways was kind of strange for me.
That's fascinating. So in the Rochester course, you sort of teach editing as well as translation, and
there's 2 classes in there. They sort of tie together. The publishing one is supposed to be everything about publishing. It starts out with the students trying to create their own imaginary press and put together a budget, which this semester they managed to lose $436,000 in the first year, which is an amazing new record. They just let them free reign, and then like, oh, guess what? You're just screwed. Like you are homeless and have no life. Then they go on to learn about editing and marketing and doing fundraising and all the different aspects that we can go through using a handful of different books, like The Merchants of Culture is one of the main books that they read for this class. And then the second one is World Literature and Translation, that has sort of a craft section, a part about world literature, which is where Arno Schmidt comes in, and then reading contemporary books like The End of Days and talking to the translator of those books and having to sort of debate what makes it a great translation, what kind of guiding ideas are translators using when they're trying to work the translation in English, and what are publishers using or editors using when they're trying to edit it, and like how that fits together into kind of this whole ecosystem of translation. But the greater point with that to me has always been that I want the people that go through the program that are especially going to become translators to be better readers. And I think that if they come in not knowing a lot except for the language and not knowing the history of literature, and have a hard time being able to read things. It's like the Flaubert thing, like where people would misread Madame Bovary or like be like, "This is great. This is just like my life." And he's like, "I'm making fun of you a little bit." Right. I think the students that translate the best ones in the program are the ones that are the best readers and are able to see how the book functions, how the style, how the voice, how everything comes to be, and they're then able to like work that into their translation. So if they can't read, I don't think they can be good translators.
Yeah. And so, you also run the translation database, and I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about that and maybe the uptick in the numbers, and you could take credit for that if you wanted to.
I don't think I'm going to take credit for that. The translation database was a crazy thing that started because we named 3%. Before Open Letter ever published a book, we wanted to do something. So we started this website to kind of have information about international literature, review books that weren't getting reviewed, and sort of just to bring some exposure to international literature as a whole. And so we named it 3% after the statistic that 3% of all books published in America are in translation, which has sort of like weird origins and never quite like ever specified. And I was on a panel in Iowa with Elliot Weinberger, and he's like, it's total crap. It's not 3%. It's not even close. He's like, I get every one of these books as being on like the Penn award committees. I get everything. Like there's no way that's 3%. That's a total lie. And so I thought, well, it'd be interesting to like try and put together a list, because none of the sources for this data, like Bowker came up with something where they're like, out of whatever thousands of books, 1,426 were fiction and poetry, but what were those books? Like, no idea. There's none of that information was available. So I thought it would be cool to put something together as a database to just see like what we could find. And my concept, which worked out fairly well the first year, was I went through like 1 million catalogs and websites and everything, spent months doing this and putting it all into this database, and then I sent out a message or like a press release saying that it was complete and accurate and a complete listing of all translations that came out in like 2008, and knowing full well that every translator who didn't have a book on there would be pissed off and would email me telling me that I had left their book off and that I was completely wrong. And so like within like 3 weeks I got all the books that I'd been missing, and it was like, it worked out wonderfully. So then we just kind of kept it up, and in the beginning I only look at fiction and poetry and only books that have never appeared in English before. So like the retranslation of Kafka's not in there because Americans had access to that in a sense, even though it was different, all that kind of stuff. But it's easier for me to like bring it down to like the things that hadn't been there. And in the beginning, for fiction and poetry, there's 362 books in 2008, and now in 2014 there are 550. So in terms of like overall numbers, 200 doesn't seem like a lot, but it's getting close to doubling the number that had existed just like 6 years ago. And I think that does show that there's something going on. There's like, I've broken it down in 1 million different ways, and the one that stands out the most is that the handful of presses like Europa, Dalkey, Amazon, who else fits into there, New Directions, have been doing more books in translation over the past couple of years than they had prior to that. So the top presses are increasing. But then also, it's gone from like 110 presses that had published a book in translation to like 190 last year. So there's more people doing books in translation or international works of literature, and the ones at the top are doing more as well. So we end up with this kind of growth that's happening, and I think that that's important, something that will continue to build, I hope.
Yeah, that's great. That's really good. So does that make you happy as a young translator person?
It's encouraging, but I mean, certainly translation is an intimidating field. I have very few illusions about the reality of publishing and translation, thanks largely to Chad.
I break everyone's dreams.
He does. He helps us reach them, and he also crushes them.
So you're working on the UHART, are you working on other projects, or is there something you'd really love to translate?
Oh gosh. Honestly, I haven't been working on other translation projects at the moment. I'm really interested in like literary testimonial and political literature.
Okay.
So there are some things like that from Argentina that I've been looking into. Chad read part of one of them.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So yeah, that's probably what I would like to do next.
Okay.
We'll see.
Great. Wonderful. Well, I hope that happens. So I think we're going to bring all of the panelists up for a flash round of question and answer.